Hello there! My name is Justin Clumpner and I'm a painting teacher over at Rockwall High School. Today I'm going to give you a brief history of painting. We're going to start at the Renaissance and shoot all the way through to 1950s America. It's a lot to cover. So without further ado, this is a brief history of painting. First, painting is as old as humanity. Every known civilization found a way to use pigment to create imagery. You could spend a lifetime examining the artistic output of any region. We're going to spend more time looking at the painting traditions developed in Europe because they are the traditions that most heavily influence American art. But many European traditions were heavily influenced by ideas learned from other cultures. For instance, we're going to start today by talking about Florence during the Renaissance. A lot of the work created in Florence was only possible due to the wealth created by Italy's trade with the Middle East. If it wasn't for the rich red vermilion developed in China or ultramarine blue developed by Persians in Afghanistan, many of the richly colored paintings of the Renaissance wouldn't have been possible. Of course, one of the most well-known paintings of the Renaissance is the Mona Lisa. This painting became an instant icon when it was painted by Leonardo da Vinci in 1503, and it cemented his reputation as the greatest artist in Florence. It was considered so beautiful and realistic that it was found referenced in Florentine love letters. "My dear, not even the great Leonardo could capture your beauty," and stuff like that. Leonardo kept the painting with him until his death in France when he was hanging out with the French king, so now it's housed in the Louvre in Paris. It was actually stolen in 1911 and taken back to Italy, but recovered in 1913 and returned to France. Oddly enough, Pablo Picasso was a suspect in that robbery and brought in for questioning by French authorities. In 1956, it was damaged when some guy threw acid on it. Later that year, somebody damaged it again by throwing a rock at it. It's had a lot of incidences, so now it's behind bulletproof glass. Another well-known painting from the Renaissance was the Sistine Chapel ceiling, painted by Michelangelo. It's a 12,000 square foot painting commissioned by Pope Julius II for his personal chapel. It was painted between 1508 and 1512. The painting is a fresco, meaning the paint was applied to wet plaster to lock in the color. Michelangelo wanted nothing to do with the ceiling. He tried to turn down the Pope as he considered himself more of a sculptor, and he had no experience whatsoever with frescoes, so Michelangelo wrote often about how much he hated painting this ceiling, saying that his spine's all knotted from folding myself over, and I'm not in the right place. I am not a painter.
I will not obey you! Will not! Did I hear you correctly? Will not? Yes. I'll destroy it first, with my own hands.
Pretty good for your first fresco, huh? On the highest section, Michelangelo painted 9 stories from the book of Genesis. He was originally commissioned to paint only 12 figures, the apostles. But in order to get Michelangelo to take the commission, the Pope offered to allow him to paint whatever biblical scenes he wanted. And by the time Michelangelo finished, there were more than 300 figures, which included scenes of God creating the world, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and Noah and the flood. So, the painting ideas seen in the Renaissance spread throughout Europe and are institutionalized. In France, this was the result of the Salon. Beginning in 1667, the Salon was the official art exhibit of the Académie des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Between 1748 and 1890 was arguably the greatest annual art event in the Western world. The Salon exhibited paintings floor to ceiling and on every available inch of space. It was one of the only places an artist could have their work exhibited in Paris at that time. So if you didn't get your work into the Salon, it was very difficult to make a living as an artist. This meant the Salon judges got to determine what art should look like. They preferred realistic styles of painting and developed a hierarchy as to what the subject matter of a good painting should be. Paintings of historical scenes or allegories were considered the best, followed by portraits of important people. Then John Racine's landscapes and still lifes were considered low art, not very valuable. This went on for a while. And then Modernism comes in. It wasn't until Manet and the Impressionists came along that painting really began to change. Inspired by Japanese prints, the Impressionists started exploring genre scenes of everyday contemporary life and the effects of light and color on the world. This was considered highly offensive and controversial by many and was often ridiculed for looking hasty and unfinished. But the use of color by the Impressionists was so bold and exciting that it captivated people for over a century, and still captivates today. The Impressionists were followed by the Post-Impressionists, obviously. Artists like Vincent van Gogh and Henri Toulouse-Lautrec were influenced by some of the theatrical elements in Japanese prints depicting kabuki theater and the colors and floral designs in Chinese pottery. They brought those colors and expressive styles and mixed it with the language of European painting to express the emotional and psychological.
It's impossible. It's impossible.
After that, Henri Matisse and Pablo Picasso pick up where they left off to bring in design elements and ideas from Africa into European painting to develop Fauvism and Cubism. This was intended to make painting more approachable to the newly forming French middle class that aren't interested in the giant history paintings of the Salon and want something more avant-garde, which means new and unusual or experimental ideas. These artists filled their works with new ideas as to how people and spaces could be depicted and how colors could be used. After Matisse and Picasso, things get real complicated. So much so that it's impossible to compress into this lecture. But a lot of scholars see Picasso and Matisse as a launching point for everything that comes after. So let's look at them a little closer, as illustrated in How to Look at Modern Art in America by Ad Reinhardt right here. This is from 1946. Reinhardt makes the argument that all art in the 40s branches out from the work by Matisse, Picasso, and Baroque to a lesser extent. So who were Matisse and Picasso? Well, Henri Matisse was born in 1869. He was the oldest son of a prosperous grain merchant and was expected to take over the family business. He studied law in Paris, but in 1889 his mother brought him art supplies when he was bedridden due to an attack of appendicitis. He discovered a kind of paradise, as he later described it, and decided to become an artist, deeply disappointing his father. As an artist, Matisse was discovered by Ambroise Vollard, who is a French art dealer who is regarded as one of the most important dealers in French art at this time. He's credited with providing exposure and emotional support to numerous then unknown artists, including Paul Cézanne, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Pablo Picasso, Paul Gauguin, Vincent van Gogh, and many more. He was also a very shrewd businessman who made a fortune with the buy low, sell high mantra. Most of what we know about modern art wouldn't exist without the support of Vollard. Back to Matisse. He believed if painting could become closer to a form of decoration, it could surely be introduced into the lives and homes of ordinary working people. Painting would thus be liberated from the realms of academic art, becoming artisanal. This work gets him noticed by Leo Stein, a wealthy American living in Paris who becomes an avid collector of modern art. It was the Steins that introduced Matisse to Picasso. Matisse by that time was a well-dressed Frenchman, achieving ever more resounding success with young dealers, traveling and exhibiting abroad and effortlessly articulate in the cause of promoting himself, although he did receive incessant criticism and taunts by art critics. Gertrude Stein, by the way, is a very important historical figure. She was an American novelist, poet, playwright, and art collector. She was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and raised in Oakland, California. Stein moved to Paris in 1903, made France her home for the remainder of her life. She hosted a Paris salon where the leading figures of modernism and art met poets and writers such as Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald. Here you can see the incredible art collection she and her partner, Alice Babette Toklas, had collected in their home. Here are some of the artists following Matisse's lead. They move away from realistic depictions with him and exhibit together and are repeatedly criticized for their unrestrained colors. One critic, upon seeing one of these exhibitions, responded, "A pot of paint thrown in the face of the public," and called him and his followers Fauvists. That's French for wild beasts. Critics were basically saying Matisse and his followers painted like animals. Now, the joy of life seen here is considered by Matisse to be the beginning of his life's work. Regarded as one of the pillars of early modernism, the monumental canvas was first exhibited at the Salon de Independence of 1906, where its bright colors and spatial distortions caused a public expression of protest and outrage. It was bought by Leo Stein and prominently displayed in his home, where this painting triggered a flood of visitors. In Paris, the two Stein households, Leo's and Gertrude's, had become the most important places to go for anyone interested in modern art. It was this work that inspired Pablo Picasso to try and reinvent himself as a painter and led to the development of Cubism. Now, Pablo Picasso goes on to become one of the most famous names in Western art history. There are very few people in the world that haven't heard the name Picasso. So who was he? Well, Picasso was a child prodigy from Spain. He had become a master of drawing and painting at an incredibly young age. Picasso's father, a longtime artist and teacher, stated that at age 15 his son had surpassed him, and he would therefore give up painting. Here you can see the drawings and paintings of 15-year-old Picasso. Picasso then moves to Paris to continue his artistic development and lives as a poor bohemian artist. In 1901, depressed over the suicide of a close friend, Picasso launched into the austere, melancholic paintings of his Blue period. Life and The Old Guitarist are the best-known paintings of this period. Desperately poor, he restricted his palette to predominantly cold colors suggestive of night, misery, dreams, and death. His growing obsession with themes of human misery and social alienation are clearly on view. It was this work that caught the eye of the Steins. When the Steins first visited Picasso's studio, they purchased 800 francs, or about $3,000 worth of paintings, a huge sum for a painter who had burned his own drawings to keep warm in 1902, and was not much better off when the Steins showed up in 1905. By 1905, Picasso became a favorite of avant-garde art collectors. His relationship with the Steins and their wealthy art collecting friends led Picasso to financial stability. Now, as I mentioned before, seeing Matisse's joy of life challenged Picasso to try and reinvent himself as a painter, and led to the beginning of Cubism. And with that, Picasso breaks with classical perspectives, shattering objects into pieces, analyzing them, and reassembling them. Today, this is one of the most significant single paintings of the 20th century, but in 1907, nobody knew that. Not even Picasso. Matisse was horrified when he saw this painting at first. Barak almost choked. Leo Stein laughed, and Picasso, frustrated and hurt, eventually took the canvas off his stretcher and put it aside without exhibiting it. Picasso goes on to develop Cubism with the help of Georges Braque, who was a Fauvist and follower of Matisse. It is upon seeing Braque's paintings in 1908 that Matisse stated, "They're made of little cubes." A critic overheard this and wrote about it, calling the work Cubism, and the name stuck ever since. This wasn't the last time Cubism was misunderstood. Picasso once said, "The fact that for a long time Cubism has not been understood, and that even today there are people who cannot see anything in it, means nothing. I do not read English, and an English book is a blank to me. This does not mean that the English language doesn't exist. And why should I blame anyone but myself if I cannot understand what I know nothing about?" It's a pretty fancy way of calling people boneheads. Anyway, what Cubism was really trying to do was get rid of the limitations of working on the flat surface. Picasso and Braque were attempting to depict an image from multiple angles at multiple times all at once. This development cements Picasso as the new modernist to watch in Paris. By 1910, Cubism had become so popular that many artists were considering themselves Cubists. It was mused at the time that there seems to be a Cubist at every party. Robert Delaney and Fernand Léger are just two examples seen here alongside Braque. While Picasso's working on Cubism, Matisse is trying to blend design and painting. Again, Matisse believed if painting could come closer to a form of decoration, it could surely be introduced into the lives and homes of ordinary people. Painting would thus be liberated from the realms of the highbrow and become an everyday item. Now, when he saw this, Picasso said of the work Matisse was doing, "If he wants to make a woman, let him make a woman. If he wants to make a design, let him make a design. This is between the two." And in response, Picasso makes this painting, challenging Matisse to push him further. You can see these two side by side, so you can really see what Picasso was getting at, and the challenge he was laying down. And at first, Matisse even believed Picasso was mocking him in this work. But they developed a relationship, and oftentimes you can see Matisse making work and Picasso responding to it, and then Picasso making work and Matisse responding to it, and they become close friends. Now, it's in his final years that Matisse turns to what he called drawing with scissors, making his famous cutout artworks. At the end of his life, he produced some of the most vibrant and dynamic works of his career. He lived and worked in southern France, where he was confined mostly to his bed and to a wheelchair. Working with paper turned out to be an ideal solution for his limited range of movement. By the end of Matisse's life, Picasso was strapping canvases onto the roof of his car and driving them over to show Matisse. Matisse and Picasso maintained their friendly rivalry until their respective deaths in 1954 and 1973. All things considered, there is only Matisse, Picasso said, to which Matisse responded, "Only one person has the right to criticize me. It's Picasso." And of course, when you look at the current market value of Picasso and Matisse, you can see here, this painting sold for $179.4 million in 2015. And this Matisse painting went for over $80 million. So, Western culture really values the contribution of these artists. And not only that, these two artists are important to discuss because it's hard to find a contemporary painter that isn't in some way influenced by them. David Hockney, one of England's most renowned contemporary painters, is still heavily influenced by the work of Picasso and Matisse. Chuck Close, one of America's most noted contemporary portrait artists, wouldn't exist without the innovations of Matisse and Picasso. And the layered collage paintings of Mark Bradford are a descendant of the collage and cut paperworks of Matisse and Picasso. In fact, a quick stroll through Instagram will show the ideas of Matisse and Picasso are still very much being explored by painters today. Alright, that was a really long detour. But Cubism opens the door to the embrace of abstraction by artists like Wassily Kandinsky and Marcel Duchamp, seen here. And that opens the door for abstract expressionism, which is inspired by Mexican muralists and Navajo sand paintings. By looking at new ways to apply paint, artists like Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko are exploring new but old ways of how a painting can be made. Now we have to acknowledge that Jackson Pollock was dependent on the intellectual support and artistic inspiration of his wife and fellow artist Lee Krasner. She was arguably a better painter, but the misogynist art world wasn't ready to accept that in the 1950s. So, that's the abridged history of painting. I oversimplified something much more complex. These diagrams can get you a little closer as to what influences were happening at the time. But you have to kind of understand that when we're talking about American modernism, everything I've just said is Eurocentric linear narrative nonsense. See, academies and museums are constantly attempting to categorize and organize the complex happenings in art into simple stories. And of course, those academics and museums have historically been exclusively European white males. So a lot of the people and stories and cultures that exist in the world were left out. But this gives us a good knowledge base to start with, and from here we can work towards a broader and more inclusive understanding of painting. Alright, that was a lot. We hit up hundreds of years of the history of painting in minutes. We might have breezed over some things. We may have more questions. If there's anything you'd like to know, go ahead and hit up the discussion, or email me, or get a hold of me in any way you feel comfortable. Now, also, I need you to jump into Canvas and check out in the modules what I need you to do today. And again, if you have any questions, just let me know. All right? Take care, everybody.